Hey, so welcome to Brown Bag History for June 26, 2024. Today we're talking about steamboats on the Columbia River. As we begin, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is the Snipes homeland and traditional territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So the steamboat history goes back to the 1860s, before there was a community here in Revelstoke. There had been fur trade on the Columbia River from 1811 up until the 1950s. And just as the fur trade was winding down, people started to make gold discoveries on the river in the Big Bend area north of Revelstoke. This is a little sketch map from 1917 that shows some of the areas where there was a lot of mining going on. But in the 1860s, it was just a full-on gold rush. And there were probably thousands of people who came into the area. And they were even either having to walk over the passes between the Shuswap Lake and the Columbia River and then cross the river, or they were coming south from the United States and into the gold fields. So in 1865, a steamboat called the SS 49 was built for a man named Captain Leonard White. It was 114 feet long and 20 feet by 4 inches wide, and had a capacity for 75 tons of freight. So its sole purpose was to bring miners and supplies to the Big Bend gold rush. The engines came out of an early sternwheeler called the Jenny Clark, which was the first sternwheeler boat built in the Pacific Northwest. So the newly built SS 49 had its maiden trip on November 18th, 1865. It left Colville on December 6th, 1865, but encountered ice in the Arrow Lakes. They landed passengers there and turned back. So anybody who got brought up, they had to walk from the Arrow Lakes all the way up into the gold fields, either that or go back on the boat. So in April of 1886, they headed to the Big Bend with 73 passengers and reached Downey Creek 10 days later at the head of navigation below Death Rapids. And that was just north of Downey Creek. That was about as far as they could go without having to navigate the serious rapids, Priest Rapids and Death Rapids. In July 4th, 1866, the boat was delayed in consequence of high water. And we know that because we have this blaze that's on display downstairs in the museum that you can't read it too well there, but it's actually somebody has carved that and quite a fancy script, actually. It says Steamer 49, delayed in consequence of high water, July 4th, 66. And that was found by Cal Upper. And this is a rough sketch of where it was found. So this is, just at this point here is but where the Revelstoke Dam is. And below that, there was a canyon. And this is where the blaze was found, on the west bank of the river. And said that there was an eddy there that said only formed during high water due to an outcrop. And so you can, and this so shows where the blaze was found on a large cedar tree. So by the SS 49 made 3 trips up the river into the gold fields, and by the 3rd trip they only brought 3 passengers north into the gold fields, but brought the full boat south back out of the area. And many of them were broke. They hadn't found any gold. They used up their grub stakes and they were done. So the rule for Captain White is that anybody who was coming north into the gold fields had to be able to pay full fare and have a grub stake for a year, so enough supplies to keep them going for a year. But he'd take anybody out without payment to bring them back into civilization. So it was very short-lived service up here. It continued in service until 1869, but didn't make any more trips up into the Big Bend area, and was dismantled in 1874. During the railway construction days, there was a boat called the SS Kootenai, and spelled with an AI, and it was built in Northport, Washington in 1885. It was 140 feet long, and remember the SS 49 was 114, so a bigger boat, 25 feet wide with a gross tonnage of 371. And it was shipping men and materials for the CPR. There were rumors that liquor was also being shipped in from the States, but some reports refuted that. But it was purchased by a company that was established here in 1890 called the Kootenai and Columbia Steamship Navigation Company, and ran aground at a place called Bannock Point on the Upper Arrow Lake on December 3rd, 1895. There was a note in the newspaper that said the steamer Kootenai, Captain Alex Lindquist, on her trip last Tuesday morning from Wigwam to the mouth of the river, and that would have been I can't remember the name of the river right now, but it said that the river, it struck an obstruction, supposed to be a rock or snag, and sunk about 200 yards above Cottonwood Island. She was loaded with ties and was towing a scow loaded with rails and ties for the Arrow Lake branch. The captain did not at first think it serious, the weight of the scow dragging him over the obstruction, and kept on his way. But soon the boat was discovered to be leaking badly, and she was turned partly around and run onto a shallow gravel bar where the water was about 4 feet deep and not deep enough to cover the deck. The cargo belonging to the CPR and was not of a character to suffer injury. Efforts are being made to raise her by means of pumps in the bulkhead. And there was a note that I found in the newspaper by the editor, a longtime editor, A.W. Lundell, talked about Montana Slough. And he said that the story was that it was named after a rum-running gentleman from Montana who used the Kootenai to transport illegal liquor for sale to the CPR construction workers. So not outside of the bounds of possibility, that's for sure. So the company that was referred to was the Columbia and Kootenai Steam Navigation Company. It was incorporated December 21st, 1889, and they purchased an earlier company called the Columbia Transportation Company that was formed in 1888 by J. Fred Hume, William Cowan, and Captain Robert Sanderson. And when it was merged into the larger company, the partners were J.A. Mara of Mara Lake fame, Frank S. Bernard, and Captain John Irving. And they had boats on both the Arrow Lakes and Columbia River and the Kootenai Lake. And their fleet of steamers was bought by the CPR in 1897. And at that time, the CPR hired T.J. Bulger and their two sons from Portland, Oregon, as shipbuilders. And they had shipworks constructed at both Nakusp and Nelson. So the Arrowhead branch line of the CPR was completed in 1894. And after that time, the boats didn't come to Revelstoke as often because they could transport people and goods by train to Arrowhead and then navigate the upper and lower Arrow Lakes by boat, which was easier to navigate than the narrower river system. There was a small catamaran steamer called the Dispatch. It was built in 1888, and it served the area for a while. And this was under the ownership of that original steamboat company, the Columbia Transportation Company. And since J. Fred Hume was the secretary treasurer, the name Hume, if you're familiar with Nelson history at all, you'll know the name Hume, Hume Hotel. J. Fred Hume started his career in Revelstoke. Came here in 1885, had one of the first general stores here, and then he moved down to the Nelson area in the early 1890s when the mines were opening up in that area. So, but J. Fred Hume had to start here in Revelstoke. And they talk about Sproats Landing, that's near present-day Castlegar. And this is referring to the Columbia and Kootenay Steam Navigation Company Limited and their schedule. It said one of the above company's steamers will leave Revelstoke for Sproat every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 4 a.m. Returning will leave Sproat for Revelstoke every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 8 a.m. Fare each way was $5. That was in July of 1890. The SS Lytton was built in Revelstoke in 1890 at a cost of $38,000. Its first trip was on Wednesday, July 2nd, 1890. And it was built by the Kootenay and Columbia Steam Navigation Company. It left its moorings near the railway bridge and steamed down to the smelter dock. And the smelter dock would have been close to where the boat launch is now at the Centennial Ballpark. Where she was loaded with about 65 tons of rails, bolts, and fish plates for the Columbia and Kootenay Railway, and made a trip down to Sproats Landing, as I said, was near Castlegar. So it had been arranged that the first trip to Sproat should be made exclusively in the interests of the CPR officials and some of their distinguished friends. Consequently, on the arrival of number 2 Western Express, a party consisting of Messrs. Van Horn, Abbott, Chief Engineer Peterson, R.B. Angus, Senator Drummond, Colonel Baker, MPP, and T.S. Bernard, MP, boarded a caboose train and were hauled down the river switch to the dock, where several of the party accompanied Manager Campbell and President Boyle on a tour of inspection around the new smelter, after which they embarked on the steamer, which left the dock at 11:30 a.m. The large collection of townspeople of both sexes on the wharf and on the steamer Kootenay gave the boat a good send-off by their hearty good wishes and eloquent waving of handkerchiefs. Their average speed was 14 miles per hour for the 28 miles from Revelstoke to the head of Upper Arrow Lake. And they arrived at Sproats Landing at 2:30 a.m. on Thursday, July 3rd. Said at midnight, a grand display of thunder and lightning, accompanied by rain, greeted the steamboat, whose well-trimmed and painted decks shed the water like a canvas back. The average run for the whole trip, allowing for delays, was 12 1/3 miles per hour. And there was, in August of 1897, there was a note in the Kootenay Mail on the first trip by a steamboat to the Big Bend since the days of the SS 49. And it was written in the usual flowery language of the newspapers of the day. Said the whistle of the steamer Lytton on Thursday morning was of no ordinary kind, that is, with regard to its import or meaning, as it sounded a signal of departure to open up Old Big Bend to transportation and capital. Not for 30 years had the hoary hills about Revelstoke echoed to a sound of similar meaning when the steamer 49 ran, and it seemed to the imaginative listener as the little steamer breasted the current and the echoes rolled as if the hills were wishing this modern argosy Godspeed in her search for the modern golden fleece. That was the way they wrote back then. As I say, they never used one word where 40 could do. The trip began about 7:40 a.m. on the Thursday morning with Captain Troop and Captain Albert Forsland. And a large number of citizens and 20 tons of hydraulic piping were on board. They reached the sandbar below the canyon in about 1 hour and let off the passengers. Said steam was then got well up and the canyon tackled. For 15 or 20 minutes, the steamer struggled to win the first big riffle, and after 2 gallant attempts to go it alone, had to tie up and send out a line. This being done, the struggle began again, but in backing to the line, the steamer took a big sheer to the east bank and in a moment the current had it broadside, with white water breaking over her deck. She held there for a minute or two, but the line broke from the fastening, and round went the steamer like a teetotum. The spectators grew discouraged, but up the plucky boat came again, and went the line about 1,500 feet, and then for 15 minutes crawled the steamer through the rapids, getting safely over about 11:45 a.m. She went easily for a little while, until getting too much to one side, she was carried like a toy towards a big round boulder on the east bank, and though kept from it by wheel and steam, she bumped it heavily and then fell back in slack water. The line went out here again, taking a painfully long time to get paid and out fastened, and then the second long riffle in the middle of the canyon was fastened. Spectators shook their heads as the gallant little boat crawled and crawled along, and when the rope fouled under that flat stone, their faces grew grave indeed. It all came right, however, and with extra steam on, she spurted, and soon the boys on the bank were cheering and running to keep up with her. At 3:45, the Lytton was through the canyon and tied up at the small sandbar just above it to wood up. So it took them over 6 hours to get through the canyon. And on the trip down, it took them 6 minutes to get through the same stretch of water. The usual steamboats for season for the steamboats was April until the end of November, depending on the weather and when the river was frozen in the fall and deep enough in the spring. And the SS Lytton was retired in 1901. This shows the SS Columbia and the SS Lytton at Revelstoke in 1891. This would have been at the far end of Front Street, so the south end of Front Street. And you can see in the distance here, we believe this to be the original the original smelter that was built and operated very briefly in 1891 before it was closed down and then eventually slid into the river because of lack of riverbank protection and erosion of the bank. The SS Columbia was built at Little Dells, Washington in 1891, and its first trip to Revelstoke was the end of August of that year. And in 1892, it was successfully launched from her winter quarters just below the wharf on Monday afternoon. So the waves were well greased, and she slid into her native element easily and gracefully, needing only a guy rope at each end to steady her. She will commence her trips between Revelstoke and Robson as soon as the depth of water will permit. The Kootenai will not be launched just yet, the Columbia and Lytton being deemed sufficient by the CK Columbia and Kootenai Navigation Company to meet the demands of the traffic for a week or two, when excursion season will be commencing. On the newspaper on October 29th, 1892, there was a note of a berth aboard the SS Columbia. It said, Miss Columbia Florence Holiday, if she survives the novelty attending her event, will be able to boast of having a most uncommon birthplace on the Columbia River. Mrs. Holiday, who is bound for Edmonton, gave birth to a daughter on board the steamer Columbia while making the trip between the Upper Arrow Lake and Revelstoke. And when the boat was near or at Hall's Landing, there was a large number of passengers on board, including a lot of immigrants from the States. And the newcomer created quite a sensation. And they passed around the hat and raised $80 for the baby. And there was actually the Bishop of New Westminster, the Anglican Bishop of New Westminster, was on board the boat. So we actually baptized the baby on board the boat. And it said they gave this money for the young lady's benefit at the parents' discretion, and that she received the name of Columbia in honor of the ship in the river on which she was born. So the unsuspecting infant was accordingly named Columbia Florence. Had it been a boy, he would no doubt have had to struggle through life under the name of Columbus. The mother and child were conveyed to the CPR hotel, and both were doing well. And one of the passengers on the ship in 1893 was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, whose murder in 1914 precipitated the First World War. And August 11th, 1894, the steamer was destroyed in a fire. Said the fire originated in the crew's quarters, with the deckhand possibly falling asleep with a burning pipe in his pocket. The fire spread rapidly, but everybody aboard did manage to escape. Said within 10 minutes, the vessel was a total wreck, lying in 8 feet of water. Said as the boilers were heavily coated with asbestos, it was thought they would still be of use. Otherwise, the steamer is a total loss, save for an insurance of $15,000. There was a smaller boat known as the Marion that was, this is showing the SS Lytton and Columbia and Kootenay in the 1890s. Not sure, I think that might have been taken close to Robson or Castlegar area. So there was a small boat known as the Marion, just 61 feet long, built in Golden in 1888 and moved to Revelstoke in 1890. And the good thing about that boat is it could operate in very low water. That in April 23rd of 1892, so the steamer Marion arrived up from Robson on Tuesday. She brought 16 passengers from that place. And Captain Sanderson expects to run right up to the wharf next trip, the river having commenced to rise. But a large quantity of baggage was sent down to the boat on Wednesday. And on Thursday morning, she took her departure, having on board 35 passengers. And the Marion didn't run for too long. It was just didn't have the capacity of the other boats. There was also a boat known as the Nakusp, and there's a picture of it at the dock at Robson, or near Castlegar, in the 1890s. The Nakusp was built in 1895 and was 171 feet long. So they're starting to get into the bigger boats. It burned at Arrowhead in December 24th, 1897. There's a photograph of them loading wood onto the Nakusp. The SS Rossland was built in 1897. It was 183 feet long. It was called the prettiest boat. It did have a really nice look to it. It was renovated and expanded in 1909. At the time, it was the fastest steamer on the Arrow Lakes, with a speed capability of 35 kilometers an hour. It was too expensive to maintain speed on the regular run. It was designed by Captain Troop and under command of Captain Forsland, with a 300 passenger limit. It operated until 1917 and eventually foundered at the dock in the Cusp. The next year, it was raised and dismantled, and it could carry 300 passengers. It's a picture of the SS Trail, just a smaller boat, the Rossland and the Minto, Arrowhead, around 1898. The SS Kootenay was built in 1897 at the Cusp. It was 184 feet long. It was under construction when the CPR took over the Columbia and Kootenay Steam Navigation Company. It was a slower vessel because its engines weren't large enough for the size. It had a riverboat barge-like construction, making it good in shallow water, and had 4 decks, including a wheelhouse. And there's a picture of the SS Kootenay approaching Beaton in 1910. The SS Bonnington was the largest boat on the Arrow Lakes. It was 209 feet long. It was built in 1911 at Nakusp by the Bolger brothers. It had a steel hull, upper and lower cabin decks, and what was called a Texas deck and wheelhouse. It had a huge dining room, well appointed, everything, all the fine silverware and china of the day. You can see there's a high chair on the side there as well. And you can see the decks above it. So it was a very big, beautiful dining room. The dining room was 71 feet 10 inches long and over 21 feet wide, and seated 60 people. The furnishings were golden oak and mahogany, so it's very sumptuous. The lounges featured Wilton carpets, leather and Morris chairs, and mahogany armchairs. There were 62 staterooms, all with steam heat, electric lights, and electric bells. The cost of the boat was around $130,000. But it was difficult to control in a high wind because of the large superstructure. It operated on the Arrow Lakes until 1931 and was later converted to a barge for the Beaton Boat Company. And it eventually sank at Beaton. And I actually saw some drone photographs online this year of people somebody operated a drone over the site where the Bonnington had sunk. And you could actually still see the hulk of it under the water. With the very low water this year, it was still under there. The Minto is probably the most well-known boat on the operating on the Arrow Lakes. It made over 7,000 trips and over 2.5 million miles. It was prefabricated for use on the Stikine River. And it's along with the Moye, which ended up on the Kootenay Lake. So they were sister ships. They were both built to the same design. It was 161.7 feet long, with just over 30 feet wide, and a depth of 5.7 feet. Its gross tonnage was 829 tons. It had a steel framework and steel plates. The paddle wheel was at a diameter of 19 feet 4 inches and 9-inch shaft, and had a locomotive type boiler. It was replaced in 1928 by a similar boiler by Vulcan Ironworks of Vancouver. Its average speed was about 12.5 miles per hour. It was shipped in sections from Toronto and shipped in 1,000 pieces by train, first to Vancouver and then to Nakusp, where it was assembled by Thomas Bulger. And it was originally planned for use in the Yukon Gold Rush, but when things started to peter out there, the two boats were diverted to the Arrow and the Kootenay Lakes. So as I say, the Moye went to the Kootenay Lakes, and the Minto came here. It was named after the 4th Earl of Minto, who was then Governor General of Canada. It was part of the CPR's Inland Lake Service. So it launched at Nakusp on November 19th, 1898. And by December 19th, 1898, it was planned to replace the SS Rossland on the Arrowhead to Robson run for the winter. And its composite hull and shallow draft made it ideal for battling low water and ice. The Minto was, note from the book by E.L. Affleck called Sternwheelers, Sandbars, and Switchbacks. He said the Minto was decidedly less pretentious in appearance than the Rossland or the Kootenay, but she could do a good turn of speed without consuming an undue amount of fuel. She was small enough to be maneuvered into awkward landings, yet heavy enough to carry a good cargo, and comfortable enough to be suitable for the first-class passenger trade, and was able to accommodate 93 passengers, including 53 in cabins. It had a crew of between 12 and 22 people. So the regular run was Arrowhead to West Robson, 135 miles, and made about 25 regular calls along the way. And it would stop on other places along the route if people put out a flag or a smoke signal to indicate they wanted the boat to stop for them. It had it was a steel-hulled ship. It made it more appropriate for winter use. It was the longest-serving ship on the Arrow Lakes. See, I've got too much information here. By 1930, the fleet on the Arrow Lakes had been reduced to only the Minto, Bonnington, and Columbia, and the Bonnington retired in 1931. After that, the Minto maintained a summer service between Arrowhead and Robson, but during the winter months, the Columbia worked the lower Arrow Lake, while the Minto confined her services to the upper Arrow Lake. By 1933, the Minto had reached the 1 million mile point, and In 1948, there was a note, this is from the book Stern Wheelers and Switchbacks, said there was extremely deep snow and ice on the lake. It said because the Arrowhead Wharf was positioned so far up the bay, there was no hope of the Minto docking there for some time. It was only through great effort that she was able to nose a barge up onto the beach to the east to deliver a minimum of freight, which included coal for the beaten boat. Captain Sutherland made a gallant effort to drive the steamer to the wharf in February, but although successful after 14 hours of chopping and grinding, found himself stuck again when backing out and had to wait for the Minto to help in getting loose a couple of days later. In 1948, there was severe flooding throughout British Columbia, and the SS Minto landed in the slough at Arrowhead, where the wharf and even the pilings had disappeared. People lined up in front of Crawford's store to witness the spectacle of debris-laden water rising steadily up the station walls. Men have an account by Otto L. Easterbrooks, who was the son of steamboat master George Ludlow Estabrooks, who worked on the steamboats in BC. Otto was born in New Brunswick in 1889, came to New Denver in 1893, and to Okanagan Landing in 1898, where his father was the captain of the SS Aberdeen. And then Otto became a steamboat captain. And he said, in 1947, I succeeded to the charge of the stern-wheeler Minto. He said, no one, he talked about the difficulty of going through the Narrows, and said, first to be tended to on my return to the Minto were times and courses from departure at Nakusp to the snag-infested entrance to the Narrows, then around the twists and bends all the way down and up the channel. It was mostly guesswork at first. There were no charts during my time. No one would trust his predecessors' courses. Fog could be expected any morning or night. All lights were covered at night. We had a dim red light, an idea imported from Sacramento riverboats, to light the compass because red light affects eyesight least, while looking constantly back and forth from the lighted compass into the fog or the darkness ahead. With courses and times recorded, it would be a compass course for a known number of minutes and seconds, twirl the steering wheel 3, perhaps 5 spokes until changing to the next course. It was the same way all the way down the bends. And talked about ice, said ice is nice to skate on, but in every other way, it was enemy number one, defying steamer operations during winter months. Any exposed wood of a boat's hull passing through it would soon have a hole on the waterline. I experienced such trouble one of my last winter runs on the Minto. Running through the thin ice without an icebreaker ahead, some iron sheathing was torn off at the waterline, resulting in an opening for water to pour into the hull. Young Manning, a crew member, spotted it. The engineers found they could control the leak, so we turned around and backed through the ice. The buckets of the wheel dropping down flat on the ice while backing through it could open a channel in several inches of ice without much damage to the wheel. The engineers never agreed with my little damage theory. Their crew had to go out on the slippery fantail in freezing weather to make repairs. And so in later years, the steamboats were attracting steamship enthusiasts. The National Film Board made a film about the Minto, and there was an article in the Saturday Evening Post. The final run of the Minto was on April of 1954, and they placed a wreath on the front of the boat. The CPR announced the retirement of the Minto, said losses on the Arrow Lakes operations had reached $100,000 annually, and beyond ordinary maintenance, an additional $16,000 would have to be spent on the wharves at Nakusp and Robson. The Minto would have required an expenditure of $10,000 for an overhaul to pass the next inspection, and that had over 2 million miles on it at that time. So the Vancouver province did an article on April 26, 1954 on the last trip, Said her paddle wheel was whipping the lake surface into froth. All her flags were at full mast, and she carried a huge cedar wreath across her bow as Captain R.S. Manning pulled the cord to sound Minto's whistle for the last time. Minto carried a full passenger list, composed mostly of folk who had been aboard in past years. Every port of call from East Robson northward on the Arrow Lakes paused to pay tribute to the veteran ship. An old-timer, Jock Ford, with kilts and pipes, brought tears to the eyes of nearly everyone as he piped a last farewell to the Minto from the shores of Fulmore Point across the lake from Edgewood. All staterooms were sold out for the last trip from Robson West. One passenger was Mrs. Olive Maitland of Winnipeg, who had ridden on the Minto's maiden voyage in 1898. In the narrows between the two lakes, a dredge crew placed another wreath aboard, and the dredge carried the message, "Farewell, Minto, well done, old girl." And at the cusp, they held a dance for the crew. And at Halcyon Hot Springs, Brigadier General Burnham, who had been running the lodge for about 30 years, had tears in his eyes, and he was asked would he consider leaving now that the Minto would no longer be bringing supplies. "I could never leave here," he said, and standing in his World War I uniform with 17 medals, he bared his head and waved goodbye. And they had a large and spontaneous farewell at Edgewood, with 50 people gathered on the wharf as the Minto sounded a final farewell, and they sang Old Lang Syne. The docking at the cusp, the passengers gathered in the Minto's bow, grouped around a fellow who's a musician and sang old favorite songs. So the Minto was purchased by the village of Nakusp for $1, but they couldn't finance restoration, and they sold it for scrap, with the boiler, engines, and paddle wheel being removed. A man named John Nelson of Galena Bay bought the hulk for $800 in 1956. He planned to restore it, but was never able to do so. He died in 1967, and at that time they were preparing the valley for the flooding of the Hiro Dam, or Hukimiside Dam, and they towed the boat into the middle of the lake and set fire to it. So they refer to it as having a Viking funeral. The Revelstoke had its own stern whaler for some time. The SS Revelstoke was built at the cusp in 1902 for the Revelstoke Navigation Company, a locally formed company with several local businessmen, including T.E.L. Taylor, Florence McCarty, G.S. McCarter, Dan Robinson, and J.D. Molson, the Molson's Bank. And it was designed for a service into the Big Bend. And it was designed by Captain Troop and was under command of Captain Forsland, with Henry Colbeck as engineer. And Colbeck Road is named after Henry Colbeck. It was licensed to carry 10 passengers, but as you'll see, it often had more. It was launched on January 8th, 1902 at Nakusp. And a large number of Revelstoke people went down to Nakusp for the event. Said a large number of the excursionists rode down with the boat over the waves, which to some was doubtless a thrilling experience. Just as the splash was made by the Revelstoke, immense sounds of welcome were given by the steamers Rawson, Kootenay, and Minto. The christening service ceremony was performed aboard the steamer after launching by Miss Blanche McCarty, daughter of the president of the Revelstoke Navigation Company. The ladies of the party left by the Minto to Arrowhead, where the brave and the free preferred to go by the new boat, and continued their celebration on board. The hull was 120 feet long by 22 feet by 4 inches in beam. It said it would draw about 2 feet unloaded, and it was designed not to sit too far down in the water. So it was made for river service. The freight capacity was 40 tons. The first trip to Revelstoke was May 16th, and the maiden trip to the Big Bend on June 8th. It was loaded with 10 tons of freight and went to the head of the canyon, going through in 20 minutes, a line only being required once to get her through the big riffle. It said Sunday at 5 a.m. a start was made for LaPorte, reached at 10:45 a.m. and ran right through to Priest Rapids. So that was the farthest up that a steamboat had gotten up the river at that point. It was brought back down to 8 Mile that evening and made the run from Boyd's Ranch of 31 miles in 2 hours, including 2 landings. The crew for the season was Captain Forsland, Engineer Colbeck, and purser and mate R.W. Troop. And they had a fireman and 4 deckhands, a cook, and a waiter. They took 8 passengers north and 2 more on the return trip. And we have the manifest of the SS Revelstoke in the museum, and it's on display with the steamboat display downstairs. We have the model of the SS Minto and the model of the SS Revelstoke, both made by David Williams, on display. The manifest is in that exhibit case. In August 1902, it went to the foot of Death Rapids, 5 miles further up than any boat had been able to do at that time. So we've got quite a few photographs of the Revelstoke. It's a picture of it at Downey Creek and at Revelstoke. And it's an interesting picture. It says, taken from the roof garden of the Central Hotel. And you can see it approaching underneath the railway bridge. And, just north of Revelstoke. That's from a hand-colored postcard. This one was reproduced from a glass negative we had in our collection. And this was the first fall fair at what's now the golf course area. That was Columbia Park, and they had a fairgrounds there and a racetrack. And the SS Revelstoke brought passengers up for that from town up to the park. So you can see all the people on the decks getting ready to land at the park for the fall fair. And it was used as a party boat more than once. So this was a group that had gone down to Hall's Landing. And you can see they even have some musicians on board there. So they went down to Hall's Landing for a picnic. And here's another one where they went to St. Leon Hot Springs in 1909. So unfortunately, the SS Revelstoke was destroyed in a fire at Comaplex that was around the northeast arm of the upper lake, around from Arrowhead. There was a big sawmill there, and there was an arson fire of the sawmill. Somebody set fire to the mill in several places, and they cut the water system, so there was no chance of putting out the fire. The whole mill was destroyed, and a few other buildings in Comaplex, and along with it was the SS Revelstoke, which was tied up at the dock for the season. So that was the end of the Revelstoke. And they did an investigation into the fire, and they had a hefty reward for information, but nobody ever came forward, and that crime was never solved. So that's sort of a rundown of some of the major boats on the Columbia River. And this is a picture of the SS Moy at Caslow several years ago. If you get a chance to go to Caslow, it's well worth the trip. You can do a tour of the boat, and it's run as a National Historic Site. So thank you for joining us today. And this is our last brown bag history for the spring, and we'll see you in September.